whether the domestic ambiance back to the United States would allow the Biden administration to be able to turn that page, I'm not quite sure right now. And however, also equally in China, that sense of anti-American sentiment has been riding extremely high at the same time. So the domestic conditions of both countries are not very much favorable in terms of improving this bilateral relationship. I mean, this really marked a moment of somehow the reconnection between Beijing and Washington. It is indeed very significant, that is to say, the both parties would prefer to turn the page because of this balloon incident. But on the other hand, I think let's not put in too much hope by just a single 2 days visit. I think this visit is more about reconnection, reconnect with between China and United States, and less about detente between the two parties.
A short visit, just 2 days. What's packed into that time?
Well, obviously, it's very packed, and I think there's a whole list of grievances between both countries, and you're expecting to lash out on both sides. So, irrespective on technology, on human rights, on political ideology, and also on economic competition. So, there's a whole range of things. But ultimately, I think the success of this visit would be, as the benchmark to be judged, is whether Tony Blinken will be received by the Chinese President Xi Jinping or not. Because earlier this week that Xi Jinping has met Bill Gates, but obviously if the US Secretary of State was not able to have audience with the Chinese president, and that still show the nature of this bilateral relationship remain quite tense.
How unusual is it that Secretary Blinken is in Beijing and yet we don't yet know if he will meet President Xi Jinping?
Well, it is unusual in a way, but I think this is also from Beijing's side trying to signaling by saying they are not really pleased with the current state of US-China relations. So yes, it is unusual, but I think on the other hand, it's also the way that Beijing is trying to express its own anger.
The US has, in the run up to this trip, have been really playing down the prospect of there being any major breakthrough as a result of this visit. How likely do you think it will actually improve Chinese US relations in any meaningful way going forward?
Well, to go forward, obviously the structural challenge between the two countries remains to be there, irrespective on technology or on global dominance. But I think on the other hand, the way to judge as being a partial success for this event is whether Xi Jinping will be able to attend the APEC meeting among the Asian leaders, and which will be held in San Francisco in November this year. And if that agreement and that invitation Tony Blinken has been able to secure for Xi Jinping, and I would consider this would be a partial success for the visit.
What have we seen of Blinken in Beijing so far, and what do you take from what we've seen?
Well, what I've seen, I mean, there's very little information available right now. And what I've seen so far is a picture of the Chinese foreign minister, and also together with Tony Blinken, and with a line of aides together. So far, there's a very little information we've received so far. And what we do know is that I think neither side have to really put too much hope on this visit at all. And also previously, you had the Treasury Janet Yellen and also the Minister of Commerce of the United States visited China as well. So ultimately, I think really for Tony Blinken, it is whether he will be able to play a true diplomat role or actually not, whether they would like to worsen the relationship or actually looking for some meaningful improvement between the two.
On that point of playing the role of a true diplomat, how large does this suspected spy balloon loom amid meetings? Is it likely to be the elephant in the room?
Well, I think both sides now seems to, judging from the language from both sides, seems both sides would like to choose to forget, try to turn the page of this so-called balloon incident, and whether the domestic ambiance back to the United States would allow the Biden administration to be able to turn that page, I'm not quite sure right now. And however, also equally in China, that sense of anti-American sentiment has been riding extremely high at the same time. So the domestic conditions of both countries are not very much favorable in terms of improving this bilateral relationship.
How much do we know about how this is being perceived, reported within China?
Again, I mean, I think judging from the statement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they're always 1 day or half day lag behind and what has been reported. That has been the convention in the past. So far, as I said earlier, I received very little information from the official channel.
Let's just talk about the meeting of presidents. Could this set the stage for Xi Jinping, Joe Biden to come together at multilateral summits later this year? Is that likely?
I think that's very likely. Firstly, APEC is this kind of regional organization that China always prefer to engage with, because that's where China will be able to wielding its economic influence. But I think secondly, this is also due to the fact that ever since Biden came to the presidency, came to the office, that Xi Jinping has never really met him in person. So I think, except a very few hours in November last year. So I think that both leaders want to seeking the opportunity to have dialogue. But even though by just having dialogue may not yielding any substantial result in terms of improvement of this bilateral relations, I would say, because as I said earlier, it is because of structural challenge, both on economics, on the technology, and also on the political system, that America considered China as being the ultimate rivalry.
You mentioned that brief meeting in November. That was in Bali, wasn't it, between Biden and Xi Jinping? And a very brief meeting, but one that seemed relatively amicable, did it not?
Well, it was rather amicable as it is. I mean, as the two sides try to play the diplomatic niceties. But how much really, as I said earlier, the domestic political environment within the United States would allow Biden to be soft on China? I think I have some serious doubt in here.
And just finally, how much does this trip speak to the US state of mind when it comes to relations with Beijing? That it's Antony Blinken being sent to or going to, it kind of takes away his choice in the matter by putting it that way. But it's the US Secretary of State, this very senior diplomat, going to Beijing. Does that speak to the state of mind of the US really being on a mission almost to calm tensions, to ease relations?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, it's less about the mission. It's more about to reopen the dialogue channels in here. And I would like to add in a reference in here, even though Tony Blinken has been the number 3 or number 4 most powerful person in the United States, however, his counterparts in China, it's not on that equal power diagram. So the Chinese foreign ministers and also the office or chief for representative for foreign affairs office by no way is as powerful as Tony Blinken. So on the power parity, the two parties are very different. That's why I said earlier, if Tony Blinken will be able to secure a meeting with Xi Jinping directly, and that will be judged as a partial success for the visit.
Let's just quickly reflect on the meeting that you've already mentioned between the Chinese leader and Bill Gates, his, I quote, old friend. What do we take from that meeting? What does that signal?
Well, I think it really signaled two things. And firstly, that the Chinese leadership still has an interest to have a dialogue with America, whether it is a business leaders or political leaders or normal person on the street. So that's one way. But I think on the other hand, Xi Jinping is also trying to give a signal that even though as the political relationship between two countries become quite difficult, that China is still very much interested in having American businesses invested in China. But that is the positive side. Now, on the negative side, I think Xi Jinping is very keen to send a signal saying, I value Bill Gates more than the White House these days.